He fell in love with the silence she lived in and gave her a forever she never thought she'd have. The quiet hum of the early morning in Willow Springs was a comforting constant. Tucked between golden meadows and sleepy hills, the town seemed wrapped in an eternal husha, kind of stillness that invited you to slow down and listen to the things often drowned by noise elsewhere. For Harper Lane, the silence wasn't just a backdrop. It was her reality. Harper had lost her hearing in an accident when she was 17. Now, in her late 20s, she had embraced the silence with quiet grace. She lived alone in a cozy cottage at the edge of town where flower beds spilled over with wild daisies and lavender, and wind chimes danced in the breeze she couldn't hear but could always feel. Each morning began with a walk to the local bookstore cafe where she worked part-time, her sketchpad always tucked under her arm and her mind filled with quiet stories she never said aloud. On one particularly crisp autumn morning, as she walked, the familiar cobbled path, leaves swirled around her boots, and the scent of cinnamon from the bakery 2 blocks down reached her nose. The town was beginning to stir. She rounded the corner, hands deep in her coat pockets. When she collided with someone, books went flying, sketchpad slid across the pavement, and Harper stumbled back. "Oh, sorry," the man said, bending quickly to gather her things before. Realizing she wasn't reacting, Harper blinked, looking up into a pair of startled eyes. They were ocean deep and kind, and they softened when he noticed her slight confusion. "I'm so sorry," he said again, slower this time, and then paused as he caught a glimpse of the small hearing aids in her ears. Recognition dawned on his face. He carefully raised a hand and signed the most basic phrase he knew. "Are you okay?" Harper's eyes widened in surprise. She wasn't used to strangers trying, even clumsily, to communicate in her language. She gave a small smile and nodded. Then, gently taking the sketchpad from his hands, she flipped to a clean page and wrote, "Yes, just not used to people bumping into me before coffee." The man let out a chuckle, running a hand through his hair. "Fair enough," he said and gestured toward the page with an amused raise of his brow. She grinned and scribbled again. "Harper," he pointed to himself. "Ethan." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by fallen leaves and scattered books. Ethan handed her the last novel from the ground, an old poetry collection by Rilke, and their fingers brushed. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of spark movies exaggerated, but something about it felt oddly grounding. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and tilted her head in curiosity. Why was a stranger with soulful eyes and soft hands carrying poetry on a Tuesday morning? Ethan, sensing the question in her gaze, held up the book. "I'm taking over the bookstore," he explained, motioning vaguely toward the shop across the street. "My uncle used to run it. I just moved back." Harper's brows lifted. She scribbled fast. "You're the new owner of Words and Whimsy?" He nodded. "That's me, and the chaos arriving to ruin your peaceful routine." She laughed, silent but visible, and scribbled one more note. "You might be chaos, but you're holding Rilke. That earns you some grace points." Their eyes met and held. For a moment, the town noise faded, not that Harper heard it anyway, and in that brief stillness, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, of recognition, of the heart catching. Its breath. Ethan took a bold step forward. "Would you want to show me the best coffee spot in town?" Harper hesitated only a second before nodding. She gestured for him to follow, and side by side, they began walking, her steps small and sure, his tentative and eager. Neither of them knew then how deeply that one moment would echo through the days ahead, how silence could hold more meaning than 1,000 words, and how love, the kind that sneaks in gently, had just found its opening. The days that followed seemed to fold gently into one another, like pages in an old novel being turned with care. Willow Springs moved at its own pace, unaffected by the rush of the outside world, and Harper liked it that way. Her world had always been quieter, but it was rich in color, texture, and feeling things she noticed in every subtle shift of wind through the trees or the way the light danced across the bookshelves in the store. Ethan had become a new piece. In that familiar puzzle, not intrusive, not overwhelming, but present, a steady presence she didn't expect. After their unexpected meeting, he began showing up at the bookstore every morning by 8, an hour before official opening, fumbling with the register or restocking books in completely illogical order. Harper had walked in one morning to find the poetry section sandwiched between travel guides and science fiction. When she raised a brow, he just grinned and offered a playful shrug. She started helping him sort things out. Not because it was her job, it wasn't. She was only the part-time display designer, hired to make the window look like a story itself, but she found herself lingering more, writing notes for him when he forgot how to sign something, rearranging shelves side by side. They learned how to speak in silences and glances, and scribbled jokes and half-learned hand signs. He began carrying a small notebook just for her to write things down when he couldn't sign fast enough. Ethan, she learned, had grown up visiting his uncle here every summer. His family had moved away when he was a teenager, chasing better jobs and bigger cities, but the bookstore had always felt like home. When his uncle passed, Ethan left his corporate job in Chicago to return. I didn't know what I was missing. He had written to her one day, sitting on the bookstore steps, the late afternoon sun warming both their faces. I used to think noise was everything, but here, it's the first time I've heard myself think. Harper watched him as he said those words, not with his mouth, but with his eyes. He was adapting, slower than most, but with an earnestness that disarmed her. It wasn't just about learning her world. It was about unlearning his own. Her cottage became their quiet haven on rainy evenings. She would brew herbal tea, and he would bring over secondhand books they could silently read together, sitting in comfortable proximity on her threadbare sofa. Sometimes they'd cook dinner well. Harper cooked, and Ethan got in the way. He always managed to misplace the salt or chop the vegetables unevenly, but it made her smile, and that was enough for him. But beneath all this newness and warmth, there were layers neither had touched yet. Harper still carried shadows from her. Past relationships that treated her silence as a burden, not a part of her. The accident that took her hearing had also fractured her confidence. She didn't let people in easily, especially not into the parts of her she had spent years patching together with solitude and art. And Ethan, for all his kindness, held a loneliness she hadn't quite figured out yet. He often deflected with humor, but there were nights he stared at the fireplace a little too long, his thoughts far away. He rarely spoke of his life before returning. There were stories there, unfinished chapters he wasn't ready to read out loud. One late afternoon, they sat outside the bookstore beneath a fading sky, autumn crisp in the air. Harper handed him her sketch pad, where she had drawn a small scene, 2 people sitting on a bench surrounded by books and stars overhead. Ethan looked at it for a long time, before writing beneath it, "You always draw what you feel, don't you?" She nodded, then after a pause, wrote back, "Don't you?" He considered it, tapping the edge of the sketch pad. "I guess I'm still figuring out how to feel without explaining it away." She smiled softly, then leaned her head against his shoulder. It was the first time she had touched him like that without need or reason, just quiet trust. His breath caught briefly, then settled. He didn't move. There were no grand declarations. No sweeping gestures or cinematic music swelling in the background. Just the creak of the bench, the faint rustle of wind in the trees, and the space between 2 people slowly filling with something deeper than friendship. In that silence, love had begun its quiet bloom. As the weeks passed, Evelyn and Daniel found themselves drawn into each other's orbit in ways neither had expected. What had begun as small, fleeting encounters evolved into long walks through the park, unhurried conversations over coffee, and moments of comfortable silence shared in the library. Evelyn had a way of listening that made Daniel feel seen truly, seen as if she could hear the emotions behind the words he didn't speak. And Daniel, with his steady presence and quiet warmth, became the only person who made her feel calm in a world that was often too loud. One afternoon, while organizing books in the reading corner, Daniel caught Evelyn watching him with a soft expression. He smiled gently, and she quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing. It was a brief moment, but one that lingered with both of them. That evening, Daniel sent her a note handwritten and left at the front desk of the bookstore. "I don't know what I'd do without the peace you bring into my days," it said. Evelyn folded the note with trembling fingers and kept it in her journal, unsure what to do with the feelings it stirred in her heart. They began to fall into a rhythm movie nights where they laughed at old black and white films, music evenings where Evelyn played piano and Daniel sat beside her, their shoulders touching lightly, hearts thudding louder than the music itself. Sometimes they shared secrets and whispers, voices barely above the hush of rain falling against the window pane. Evelyn told him about the accident that had taken her hearing and her father. Daniel, in return, opened up about his own silence, the years spent navigating grief after his mother's death, and the isolation of being misunderstood. Each encounter deepened their bond. When Evelyn reached for Daniel's hand while crossing a busy street, she held on a little longer than needed. And when Daniel brushed a strand of hair from her face during a bookstore event, the air around them grew heavy with unspoken words. Their friends began to notice the way they looked at each other, how their gazes lingered, how they seemed to breathe in sync even in the quietest moments. Still, neither dared to voice what was growing between them. There was a tension that hovered gentle, tender, but undeniable. Every time their fingers brushed or their laughter mingled, the distance between friendship and something more became thinner. One night, as they sat on the rooftop of the bookstore watching stars pierce through a velvet sky, Daniel turned to Evelyn and whispered, "Do you ever feel like some silences are louder than words?" Evelyn, her eyes reflecting the starlight, nodded slowly. "Especially with you," she signed, and for a heartbeat, they just looked at each other too. Souls standing at the edge of something beautiful, both afraid to fall, both unable to walk away. Evelyn had never known comfort quite like this. With Daniel, even the silence between them felt full of understanding, warmth, and something that increasingly felt like love. Their bond deepened in the quietest ways, in the shared looks while shelving books, in the way their hands naturally found each other's during walks, and the way Daniel waited for her to finish, citing her thoughts before responding with such patience and grace that it made her heart ache. He never made her feel like she had to speak to be heard. He simply listened with his eyes, his stillness, and his steady heart. Daniel began to make small gestures that said more than words ever could. He learned more sign language, fluent enough now to hold conversations that made her laugh and even cry. He'd surprise her with notes written in cursive and tucked inside her favorite novels at the shop. Once, on a rainy day, she found a note inside Pride and Prejudice that read, "If I were Darcy, I'd fall in love with you all over again, every single page." She pressed the note to her chest, overwhelmed by the depth of something she still couldn't name but knew was real. One evening, Evelyn invited him over for dinner. She lit candles, cooked pasta from her mother's recipe book, and played soft piano music on her speaker. It wasn't extravagant, it was intimate. They talked about childhood dreams and the families they missed, about the fear of being too broken to be loved, and the hope that maybe love was still possible anyway. When Daniel told her, he used to stay up late drawing blueprints for tree houses. He'd never build. Evelyn reached out and gently held his hand. I think you still could, she signed with a soft smile. And in her eyes, he saw belief, the kind that made him want to believe too. Their connection felt sacred, like a thread that had always existed, only now being pulled taut by time, trust, and the tender vulnerability they offered each other. Daniel started spending more time at the bookstore even when he wasn't working, just to be near her. They'd have lunch in the quiet courtyard behind the store, where the vines curled like whispered promises along the fence. Sometimes Evelyn would rest her head on his shoulder and he'd close his eyes, memorizing the feeling. One Sunday morning, Daniel showed up with a box. Inside was a handmade leather journal. On the first page, he had written, "For all the things you felt that the world never heard, I see you, I hear you." Evelyn's eyes welled up, and for the first time, she didn't try to hide it. She wrapped her arms around him, and he held her tightly, their embrace long, quiet, and full of meaning. They were falling in love, not in a whirlwind, not in a dramatic rush, but in the way the sky turns from dusk to night, slow, certain, and breathtaking. It was in every glance, every note passed, every shared silence that said, "You matter to me." Evelyn wasn't used to someone staying long enough to learn her rhythms, and Daniel wasn't used to someone seeing him past his quiet demeanor, but together, they found a rhythm that felt like home. As the seasons shifted from soft spring to golden summer, Evelyn and Daniel's relationship deepened like the roots of an old tree, steady, strong, and quietly profound. But love, no matter how tender, often has to withstand a storm. And theirs was no exception. Evelyn had always guarded her independence fiercely. Years of people either underestimating her or treating her like someone fragile had built walls that even Daniel's gentleness had only started to chip away. So when he surprised her with an invitation to accompany him to a weekend literary retreat in Maine where he was speaking as a guest author, she froze. It should have been a moment of excitement, a shared milestone. But instead, fear crawled into her chest. The idea of being surrounded by strangers, of having to navigate unfamiliar conversations where her voice might not be heard, or worse. Pity brought back memories she'd tried to bury. School assemblies where teachers ignored her. Social gatherings where people smiled politely and then looked away. She had spent years learning how to be comfortable in her own silence. Now, the thought of stepping into a world that might not understand it, no matter how supportive Daniel was, terrified her. She declined gently, signing, "It's not for me. You should go, though." But her eyes betrayed the storm behind the calm expression. Daniel tried to understand. He asked if it was the crowd, the travel, or just the pressure. "We can stay close by. You don't even have to speak if you don't want to." "I'll be there," he offered, holding her hand, but Evelyn pulled away just slightly. "That's the problem," she signed, her movements sharper than usual. "I don't want to need you there. I'm scared of losing who I am if I lean on someone too much." Daniel felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He had never seen her walls go back up so fast, and it stung. "It's not weakness to let someone stand beside you," he said quietly. "I never wanted you to depend on me. I wanted to share the weight with you." They sat in silence, not the comfortable kind they had once shared, but the heavy kind that sat between them like a question neither could answer. Over the next week, the distance grew. Daniel buried himself in work, unsure if he had pushed too hard. Evelyn, meanwhile, wrestled with a storm of emotions, guilt, fear, and the creeping worry that she was ruining the best thing that had ever happened to her. She wanted to run to him to explain, but old fears whispered lies. What if he saw your fear as a flaw? What if this love fades when it becomes inconvenient? Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, Evelyn entered the bookstore and found Daniel in the back room. packing a small bag. His retreat was the next morning. He looked up, startled, as she stood in the doorway. "I wasn't going to leave without saying goodbye," he said softly, stuffing a notebook into the satchel. "But I figured maybe it's better to give you space." Evelyn stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she signed, "I don't want space. I just don't know how to do this without feeling like I'll disappear into someone else's life." Daniel watched her for a long moment. "You won't disappear into mine," he said, his voice thick. "I fell in love with your silence, Evelyn, not because it's quiet, but because of how full it is. You make me feel seen. I never wanted to take that from you." She blinked back tears, unsure of whether to reach for him or let him go. Her heart was torn between self-preservation and the aching truth that she didn't want a life without him. Daniel gave her a small, heartbroken smile. "I'll still be at the retreat, in case you change your mind." And then he was gone. Evelyn stood in the center of the store, her world suddenly louder with his absence. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel safe, it felt lonely. The bookstore felt emptier than ever in Daniel's absence. Evelyn moved through the familiar space like a ghost, her fingers trailing across books she once arranged with quiet joy. Now, every corner whispered his name, the shelf he straightened without being asked, the poetry section where he once read aloud, not for her ears, but for her heart. She had thought silence was her safest space, but now it echoed with what she had lost. Each day that passed only deepened the ache. She replayed his words constantly. "I never wanted to take that from you." That was the moment she realized something profound. Daniel had never tried to fix her silence or rewrite her world. He had simply asked to be a part of it. Late one evening, Evelyn sat on her balcony with the wind rustling her hair, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. In her lap was the letter she had tried to write all week. Her words had faltered at first. How do you explain a lifetime of fear in a single page? But eventually, she poured it all out. The loneliness of always being different, the exhaustion of translating her soul through gestures, the fear of love being conditional, and the startling, beautiful truth that Daniel had been the first person to see her, not as someone incomplete, but as someone whole. The next morning, Evelyn did something she never thought she would. She packed a bag. It wasn't easy. Her heart pounded with every step she took away from the comfort of her home. The bus to Maine was crowded, and the journey was long. But something inside her had shifted. She wasn't running from fear anymore. She was walking toward love. When she arrived at the lodge, the retreat was already in full swing. Groups of writers clustered in circles, words buzzing through the crisp summer air. Evelyn's heart thudded as she scanned the crowd. And then she saw him standing under a canopy of trees, a notebook in hand, speaking with gentle confidence. Daniel. He hadn't seen her yet. She hesitated, nerves clawing at her chest. What if he had already let go? But then, as if he sensed her presence, Daniel looked up. Their eyes met across the distance. His breath caught visibly, and he stepped forward slow, unsure, hopeful. Evelyn closed the space between them. Her fingers moved with trembling grace, signing what her heart had wanted to say for days. "I was never afraid of loving you. I was afraid of being loved and losing myself, but I finally understand. You were never trying to change me. You were trying to stay beside me." Daniel's eyes welled with tears. "Always," he whispered. "I've been here, Evelyn. Just waiting for you to believe that you're worth staying for." She stepped into his arms, and for the first time, her silence wasn't a wall, it was a language of love, spoken without sound, but it felt so deeply it shook the soul. The embrace wasn't grand or dramatic. It was quiet, like everything between them had always been. But it was also the loudest moment of her life, because in that stillness, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. Months passed and life settled into a new rhythm, one not defined by fear or loneliness, but by quiet connection, trust, and the kind of love that didn't need to shout to be heard. Evelyn didn't suddenly become someone different. She didn't start giving speeches or abandon the comfort of her quiet world. But something inside her had changed. Where there once had been a hesitation to let others in, now there was space. Space for growth, for love, and most importantly for Daniel. They spent weekends exploring coastal bookstores, fingers intertwined between pages and shared coffees. Daniel continued writing, often weaving pieces of Evelyn into his characters, not to define her, but to honor her. She wasn't his muse. She was his mirror, the reflection of all the softness he'd ever longed for Dot at the shop. Evelyn began hosting a small monthly gathering, Silent Saturdays. She called them where people from all walks of life came together to share poetry, thoughts, and feelings through written notes, art, and gestures. It became a safe haven not just for her, but for others who had spent too long in the shadows of their voices. One evening, after the last Silent Saturday of the year, Daniel waited until the last customer had left. The bookstore glowed with warm fairy lights, their soft flicker dancing across books and windows like whispers of joy. He approached Evelyn at the counter and took her hand. Then, without a single word, he pulled a small notebook from his jacket and opened it to a handwritten page. In the center, surrounded by doodled wildflowers and stars, were 5 simple words. "Will you marry me, Evelyn?" Her eyes widened, tears immediately brimming. She didn't need a second to think. She didn't need to ask for space. Evelyn signed slowly, lovingly, her smile trembling through the tears. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They embraced in the soft hush of the shop, surrounded by books, memories, and the shared silence that had once kept them apart, but now bound them in something eternal. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was better. It was real. And in that quiet, sacred space where silence had once been her shield, Evelyn had found her voice, and the way Daniel looked at her, waited for her, and loved her, not in spite of her silence, but because of it. She had found the love she thought she'd never deserve, the love that found her in silence.